We continue our lunchtime series of talks now with Dr. William Newton joining us once again. And the talk this time is entitled Christ Appeals to the Human Heart, which is chapter 2 of part 1 of the Theology of the Body. And in this talk it will offer a detailed analysis of the human person in the present age as corrupted by the fall and restored by Christ, and it covers human history after the fall and before the resurrection. So I'd like to invite Dr. Newton to deliver his talk.
Okay, good afternoon. I hope the caffeine is pumping through your veins, because this is the worst time to talk after people have just eaten. It's also an excuse for me, so if you fall asleep, I won't blame myself for being boring. First of all, I just want to tell you a little story I heard of a parish priest who was doing his rounds. Do you say rounds? Encouraging his flock to come to Sunday Mass, and he knocked on one door, and he thought pretty sure there was someone in there, but they didn't come to the door. So, he waited, and eventually he had little calling cards. And on his calling cards there was a little invitation, please come to Sunday Mass. Sunday Mass is this time and this time. And at the bottom it just said Revelations 4:10. And he thought nothing of it. Sunday Mass came around, and after Mass, when he was gathering the collection, he was counting the collection, he was surprised to find his little calling card back in the collection basket. And all that was written was just something on the back, which was Genesis 3:10. So, of course, he ran off to his Bible. Being a Catholic, he didn't know it by heart, unfortunately. Of course, what we need to know about Revelation 4:10, which is what he has written on his calling card, that it says this: "Look, I am standing at the door, knocking. If anyone hears me calling and opens the door, I will come in." And then he flicked through for Genesis 3:10. "I heard the sound of you in the garden. I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Now, that is not quite a cheap gimmick to make you laugh. Not quite. Because my talk will be about the question of shame, and we will see that somehow at the heart of this chapter. So anyway, what's my aim for this talk? My aim is to give you an exposition of this second chapter of Theology of the Body, and I intend to stay quite close to the text and not make too many connections, as it were, to other contemporary issues. Let us just remind ourselves then where we are in the Theology of the Body. So we are in this first part, which are the three sayings of Christ, where John Paul II is developing his adequate anthropology. His anthropology, which is going to be the foundation for what he wants to say about marriage and specifically about conjugal morality. Now, it's clear that when Humanae Vitae was presented, that Paul VI was aware that anthropology was critical to a correct understanding of the Church's teaching about conjugal morality. Let me just quote you from Humanae Vitae itself, from paragraph 7. Paul VI explains that the question of human procreation, like every other question that touches human life, involves more than the limited aspects specific to such disciplines as biology, psychology, demography, or sociology. It is the whole man and the whole mission to which he is called that must be considered. But I think it would be fair to say that Paul VI didn't really present the adequate anthropology. It was left, I'm sure in the design of providence, to his successor on the chair of Peter to really develop this anthropology and in a certain way undergird the teaching of Humanae Vitae, which is simply not comprehensible without this adequate anthropology. So my aim then is to consider this chapter where he is building part of this anthropology. My secondary aim, we'll see how this works out, I don't know exactly if it will or not, is to, or my kind of off-spin I would like to achieve by the end of the talk, is also to ground a little bit the theology of the body into the tradition of the church. I think sometimes there can be an exaggeration concerning the innovation of the theology of the body is, that somehow it's not deeply rooted in the tradition. This simply is not the case. It, I would say, is the flagship of the new evangelization called for by John Paul II. But the new evangelization is not something new, as it were, materially. It's a presentation of the perennial truths of the faith, but made in such a way that it, as it were, penetrates into the modern culture. And we have to, I think, see theology of the body in that light as well. Okay, so in this second chapter, most fundamentally, we see John Paul II consider mankind as he moves over two thresholds. The first threshold is between the state of original innocence and the fallen state. And the second threshold is between this fallen state and redemption in Christ. Now, the movement of man over this first threshold from original innocence is witnessed to by the emergence of shame, hence the pertinence of this little joke. Shame, as John Paul II terms it in the Theology of the Body, is a boundary experience. It's the experience of the boundary, the movement of man over the boundary from the original state to the fallen state. And it's fundamentally a symptom. And like a good doctor can move from a symptom to a prognosis of a disease. John Paul II, as a profound interpreter of Scripture, is able to move from this symptom, which is revealed to us in Genesis, the symptom of shame, to a prognosis of the underlying disease, which is concupiscence. Okay? So these maybe are the two fundamental realities that this second chapter is dealing with, or at least the first part of this second chapter. Shame and concupiscence. Now, shame, generically, if we define it generically, St. Thomas defines it as the fear of disgrace. It's a type of fear. But I would say, typical of John Paul II, starting from this Thomistic background, he gives a great breadth to shame, and his understanding of shame is very developed. Just as starting from a Thomistic understanding of concupiscence, he gives a great breadth to his definition of concupiscence. In this chapter, he discerns, in this chapter, giving an exegesis of Genesis and the emergence of shame, that we see this shame now existing in Adam and in Eve, he develops an understanding of three types of shame. But I'm going to give you some homework. You have to go and look at the first two, because I haven't got time to go into them. I'm going to talk about the third, which is most important for our purposes. The first is a shame of each vis-a-vis God. The second is a shame of the couple, the man and woman, in the face of creation. But the third, what is particular about the third dimension of shame is its mutuality. It's the shame of Adam in front of Eve and Eve in front of Adam. And it's specifically a sexual shame. John Paul II says we can see this because what do? They cover those parts of the body which are manifestations of their sexuality, of manhood and womanhood. So the question before us fundamentally is, what has happened to bring about this new situation, this new state of shame? Well, fundamentally what we can understand is that the sexual desires of Adam and Eve have somehow in the fall been cut loose from reason. Eve, for example, somehow she is conscious of the fact that Adam is now relating to her in a different way. The sexual desire that her naked body evokes in him is no longer under the dominion of reason. He is no longer relating to her as a human person, as the only creature willed for its own sake, but as something to be kind of had and enjoyed in a selfish way. I think there would be two other aspects that would be important to understand about John Paul II's presentation of shame in this chapter. The first would be that there's not an exact symmetry between the experience of shame on the side of the man and on the side of the woman, on the side of Adam and the side of Eve. And I think that's an experience for us as men and women. This is developed actually particularly in Love and Responsibility, which again is something you probably need in your breast pocket when you're reading Theology of the Body. In Love and Responsibility, he develops this at some length, that women experience shame in the face of the degrading attitude of a man towards her. But men are not normally fearful of that attitude of a woman towards them. Fallen men are quite keen that there would be that kind of attitude, to be honest with you. But they are more shameful of being known to look at a woman in that way, for it to be known by everybody. Yeah? If a man was clear, if for a man he suddenly realized that his thoughts, degrading thoughts about a woman, were somehow projected by virtual reality onto this screen here, he would experience shame because of that. So there's not quite a symmetry. And sometimes we have to be sensitive to that in the Theology of the Body when John Paul II is talking about shame and concupiscence. It exists in both man and woman, but it's not always quite the same thing in a man and in a woman. I think the second aspect to be understood about shame is that shame has two faces. On the one side, shame is a negative reality because it's come about when concupiscence has come about, disordered sexual desire. And so it manifests, it's a flag signaling that there's something negative now in humanity. But on the other hand, it has a positive dimension. Because, for example, shame in Eve manifests itself as a way of protecting herself against the attitude that Adam now has towards her. And so it's actually a manifestation of her own realization of her own dignity. And especially the dignity of her body, that her body is not to be considered as something to be used by a man, and therefore shame actually manifests something of the original understanding of the body. And to that extent, John Paul II says it's kind of an echo, a reverberation of the original state. So when we experience shame in a rightful way, it's somehow an echo in us of what we understood in paradise about our body. But as I've said, shame is only the surface reality. It's a symptom of an underlying disease, and that underlying disease is concupiscence. I think it's worth just considering briefly the different ways that this word concupiscence can be taken or understood in theological literature or even in common speech. Watch it, I don't know whether anyone uses concupiscence in common speech or not, maybe they do. But in theological writing, concupiscence can simply mean desire. And in that way, there's nothing bad about it. It's not a pejorative term. So in that way, it's a middle emotion. It's actually an emotion or a passion you experience. It comes between love and joy. Love is an affinity towards something. I love ice cream. Concupiscence would be desire for ice cream. And then when you get hold of the ice cream, you have joy. And so these three always go together. We have love, concupiscence, joy. But it's clearly not concupiscence understood in that way that John Paul II is pointing to, because that certainly would have existed in Adam and Eve prior to the fall. We're talking about a concupiscence which has risen up because of the fall. So it's not that use of the word. There's two other uses which he is pointing to. It's often used to mean precisely disordered desire. If you look in the Catechism under concupiscence, it will redirect you to disordered desire. Or it can even point to the tendency to have disordered desires. Not quite the same thing. I mean, I can probably be honest that at the moment I'm not experiencing a disordered desire, but I can promise you I have lots of tendencies to disordered desire in me. So would that be that distinction? But what has happened? Let's just consider that. What has happened to man that this reality, this disordered desire, this concupiscence or tendency to disordered desire has suddenly become a reality in man and woman? There has been a fracture, or we should say a disintegration of the original integration of the soul and the body and the bodily desires. Before the fall, by a special gift, which we call original innocence, grace, Adam and Eve's rational powers were, as it were, at home in the lower bodily desires. It's not simply a matter that they could dominate the lower desires, that reason could always dominate sexual desire or desire for food. Reason actually impregnated these desires. It had a home there. But when man rebelled against God, there was a fracturing within man, so that these powers no longer were completely impregnated or under the control of reason. St. Augustine notes in the way that only he can that this is totally fitting, because